My guest today on the Essential Coaching Skills podcast is Robert Vetter. Bob is a healer and soul coach who utilizes a combination of indigenous-inspired and Western methods to co-create lasting change for everyday modern problems. I'm sure you're going to enjoy this conversation as much as I did, and we'll have him back for more, I promise. You are listening to the Essential Coaching Skills podcast, a show devoted to uncovering the systems and the secrets that set the best apart, where you learn how to take your coaching clients to the next level, while you grow the coaching practice of your dreams. So sit back and relax, or sit up and get excited. Either way, you might want to pay attention. This could be important. So I'm here with Bob Vetter. Bob, welcome to the Essential Coaching Skills podcast.
Thank you, Doug. My pleasure to be here.
So I wanted to have you on the show because you are different. You know,
that's what everybody tells me.
You are. No, in that you do coaching. Yes, you do coaching, and you come in from a very, very different perspective than most people do. You have a unique, as far as most people are concerned, as far as I'm concerned, a unique background in, well, I'll let you tell us. You'll get it more accurately than I have. So tell us about your background, what you do with coaching that's perhaps different than what most people do.
Sure. So I think of what I do as coaching with a very strong spiritual bent to it. And
you are, just for the record, you are a cultural anthropologist as well?
I am a cultural anthropologist, guilty as charged.
Okay.
And, from the time that I was a kid, I was interested in alternative spirituality. Being in high school in the 70s, it was a time where it was odd, not totally odd, but a little bit odd that I was involved. At the age of 13, I was practicing yoga and studying Hinduism and Buddhism and Taoism and really immersed in Asian culture. So I went to college in order to learn more about that. And I developed an interest at the time at the intersection of healing and spirituality, which today is not that unusual. But back then, it was kind of unusual to put those two together. So I really wanted to know about the intersection of those two things.
Why? What brought you to that?
I look back on it now, and I would say probably my own need to be healed. So if I had to say, there's something in the alternative spirituality field called spiritual bypass, which is the idea that there are people, and I would consider myself to have been one of those, who seek spirituality because they know something is amiss, something needs to be fulfilled, but they circumvent the psychological growth and development that might otherwise do that. So they seek out alternate states of consciousness, for example, as an escape from this world. So spirituality becomes this transcendent way to escape from everything that isn't working here in this world. And I would describe a lot of people who are interested in alternative spirituality in that way. And that's why when things turned for me, they did. That's sort of a prediction of what I'm about to tell you in a moment, or a foreshadowing. So I went to college with that interest. I wanted to go to Asia to do field work. I had a major in anthropology and a minor in philosophy, which means that I was kind of looking at philosophy looks at the ideal and anthropology looks at the real, what people actually do, as opposed to what they say they do. So I wanted to go to Asia to do my field work. I ended up going to India when I was in college. And then I had planned on doing field work in Asia in grad school. And I thought I was going to end up going to the University of Hawaii, to the East-West Center, a program there. I was rejected from it, and I was absolutely devastated because I was really counting on that. I'd only applied there and to the New School for Social Research in Manhattan. So I was going to take a year off and decide what I was going to do. And at the last minute, my philosophy professor from undergrad at Oneonta told me that he was from India, and there was a philosophy professor from India teaching at the University of Oklahoma. And he told me that they had a graduate assistantship, a full assistantship. If I wanted it, basically, I could just walk right into it. So I did, and I moved to Oklahoma. Wow. And I started these courses in philosophy, which I absolutely hated. I mean, I hated every minute of it. And I was gonna drive back to New York, just pack up my car and move back to New York, maybe 3 weeks into the semester. So on a lark, I walked into the anthropology department, and they needed somebody that day to teach anthropology, introduction to anthropology. So I went from being an undergrad to teaching undergrads like overnight. I had to figure out how I was going to teach this course. So I was still interested in Asian culture. Now, the catch-22 was that I had to teach, but in order to teach, I had to have a full course load, and it was too late in the semester to switch classes, to start new classes. So they decided that they would let me do independent study for the 6 or 9 semester hours of credit that I needed as a minimum. And I decided that I would do ethnographic fieldwork. Now, cultural anthropology has 2 branches: ethnography, that looks at one culture in depth, and ethnology, which is where you take a topic and just look at it cross-culturally.
I'm sorry, could you say those 2 words again?
Yeah, ethnography is where you go into the field and you study a culture by living in and among the people and go with depth into that particular culture. Ethnology is more on the surface, and it takes a topic and then compares how that is utilized or practiced in lots of different cultures.
Gotcha.
So they decided that they would let me do my ethnographic field work. And since I found myself in the middle of Indian country, because Oklahoma at one time was considered Indian territory in the early 1800s, the government moved tribes there from as far away as California and New York, all over into Indian territory. So anyway, I found myself there. I'll try to summarize this, how all these things fell into place in this curious way. So I decided that my area of interest was the intersection of spirituality and healing. And I knew that there were medicine people. And I figured if I could meet a medicine man, I could start my field work. So I met with my advisor, and I thought that the advisor, who had spent his whole life studying the Apaches, I thought he was going to make it easy for me and just introduce me to somebody. But all he told me was, you're going to have to use a networking approach and meet one person, let that person introduce you to somebody else, to somebody else, to somebody else. I went home. I was sharing an apartment with a guy who had posted, that he needed a roommate. So it was this guy, Jim. And he said, oh, well, maybe I can help you. And I said, well, how could you help me? And he said, oh, well, I'm part Comanche. And he said, the next time my family has a gathering, I could bring you along as a guest. So his family had a gathering coming up in like a week or 2, and I went as the guest. And, came from New York. I had all these stereotypes about what I thought Native Americans or American Indians would be like. And, being direct as I am and was, I show up and he introduces me, and, we get there and there's all these old men sitting under a tree in folding chairs while the women were getting the meal together. So he introduces me, and I said, hi, I'm trying to find a medicine man. I'm hoping to meet a medicine man. And it was like crickets. Everybody, all conversations stopped. Like when you have the record, the needle on the record, you hear that scratch and everything's quiet. So nobody says anything. I'm just standing there, and they're, so, all right. So finally the meal is ready, and we go to eat the meal. And the meal is just about over. And this old man comes up to me like when nobody's looking. And he kind of says, I heard what you said about wanting to meet a medicine man. He said, we still have one left today. I don't know his name, and I don't know where he lives. No, I know his name, but I don't know exactly how to tell you to get there. He doesn't have a phone. He drew me this map on a napkin, basically. So the next week, so I tell Jim, and Jim says, "Oh, well, I'll go with you." So I'm thinking, oh, good. Jim is Comanche. He's going to know what to do. He'll know what to say. We take the map out. We drive. It would have been an hour and a half ride if we had found it, but we were lost for hours because there were no paved roads where we were going, no marked roads. So somehow we finally find this guy's house. We walk up to the door and knock on the door. Now I'm thinking, well, Jim's Comanche. He's going to know what to say. So we get to the door. I knock on the door, and I'm waiting for Jim to say something, and Jim's waiting for me to say something. And here's this old guy, man, with like long gray braids standing at the door, and he's looking at the two of us. So nobody's saying anything. So I figured, I'll just have to say the first thing that comes to my mind. I said, hi, my name is Bob Vetter. I'm an anthropology student, and I was hoping you would talk to us a little bit about the Comanches. And he goes, this is how you come to my house? Now, I didn't know what he was getting at, right? And he goes, this is how you come to my house? And I said, yeah. And he said, this is how you come to my house to see me? And I go, yeah. And he goes, come in here for a minute. So he invites me and Jim, and he points to the couch and like in a kind of a surly way, he goes, sit down over there. So Jim and I sit down, and he storms into this back room, and he comes back a minute later, and he's got this painting in his hands, and he's holding this painting up of a dancer, of a traditional dancer. I said, wow, that's really beautiful. But he wasn't interested in what I thought of his artwork. He goes, I'm an artist, and I have better things to do than to sit around talking to you. And another thing, he said, that's no way to visit an Indian. And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, well, if you're going to visit an Indian, the least thing you could do is bring them something to eat. So now I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to say. I said, I'm really sorry. We got up, got off the couch, walked out the door, got in the car, and drove home. So now I'm talking about going back, and Jim is cursing this guy up and down. He said, I wouldn't go back to that guy's house if you paid me. So next week comes, I get in the car by myself, drive all the way down there. I stop along the way. And let me tell you, I was like broke. I was like the poorest graduate student you can imagine. So I all I could afford was a few groceries in this brown paper bag. I get to the door. I knock on the door. The same old man comes to the door. He gets this big smile on his face, and I hand him the bag. He puts his hand out, and he shakes my hand, and he goes, now that's the way you visit an Indian. And that day really began my personal journey, because it turned out that he was a very famous man. He was a famous dancer. He was a famous artist. He was known as a rainmaker. And his wife was the niece of a very famous medicine woman. There was a book written about her called Sanapia, Comanche Medicine Woman. So I learned a lot about spirituality and the old ways from him. But eventually, and this is another long story that we don't have time for now, but eventually he led me to meet an old man named Oliver Patapony, who was the last medicine man of the Comanche tribe, who adopted me and took me as a grandson.
Wow.
So that was that this was like this strange twist of fate. Now, I thought that this topic that I had selected just to fulfill my requirement for the semester would be like a quick thing that I would do and be done with.
Right.
But I was so moved by those experiences that it became the direction of my field work, and everything I did in anthropology and in the years subsequent have been about Native North Americans. So there's that piece of the story. While I was in grad school, I was taking a course on ancient Mesoamerica, and the professor had done his fieldwork in Oaxaca, Mexico, and he mentioned in passing that there is a traditional form of medicine called Curanderismo that is still practiced in parts of Mexico. So my ears perked up, and I went and asked him about it, and he, told me what he knew about it. And I decided that I was going to do my field work on an extensive fieldwork project in Oaxaca on traditional medicine. And I started to study, look into it, write about it in an academic way. So I'd planned on moving there and living there for 1 year. I would do a short-term study on Curanderismo as it was practiced in San Antonio, Texas, and then compare and contrast with the way that it was practiced in rural Oaxaca, Mexico. I ended up getting a terminal master's degree and completely stopping that. And forgot about Curanderismo for many years, maintained my connection with the native people in Oklahoma. And in the meantime, I was adopted into a number of other families in other tribes. And I created my business, which at the time was in taking people from all over to go live among native people and experience their life for a week at a time. And we started in Oklahoma and eventually ended up doing it in South Dakota, Wyoming, Montana, Arizona, New Mexico, Wisconsin, and even upstate New York. So that was like, that whole chunk of the picture. I promise I'm going to bring this around in a minute to our topic at hand.
You're doing fine. Take all the time you want.
So I, throughout all of this, I was interested in the topic of healing. Now, many, many years later, after all of this happened, I joined a chapter of the Native American Church, which is the peyote religion of the Plains Indians that eventually diffused all over parts of the United States and Canada. And when I joined it, I was told, it would be good if you could come and commit to coming to one meeting per year, one ceremony per year. And I explained, I live in New York, blah, blah, blah. So we decided that the one that I would go to was the one down on near the Mexican border in South Texas. And that's where this sacred medicine grows, and where they go to get it and bring it back to Oklahoma. Mm-hmm. It's always the same weekend in February every year. So I got ready to go down there, and I could have either flown into San Antonio or Corpus Christi, and I ended up flying into San Antonio. And when I was there, I was thinking, that's right, this is where I was going to do that whole big study. And I said, I wonder if anybody's teaching Curanderismo or practicing it here. What I didn't know was that it had largely died out over those years. But I was able to find one woman who was practicing as a curandera, a traditional healer. And I met her, and, she was working in a store that was mentioned in a book called They All Want Magic. And she was the main featured healer in this book, known as La Golondrina, which is a bird. I went there, met her, and it was like I had known her my whole life. I ended up spending the whole day in the store with her. And then my flight to New York was canceled because of a blizzard. So I ended up spending an extra 4 days with her and being with her all the time learning. So she became my first teacher. Then I did an apprenticeship with Elena Avila, who wrote the book Woman Who Glows in the Dark. And I was learning these specific techniques. And then I had a series of other teachers and ended up going to Mexico to learn it. Also the Temazcal, which is the Mesoamerican version of the Sweat Lodge. And throughout all of these studies, I sort of had an idea about healing, an idea that would become kind of my own creative putting together of these ideas. And I prayed about it in the teepee during a couple of all-night prayer sessions. And, there were 2 nights in particular that I felt like I received the answer to how to do this. Now, when you look at, I think back to what I learned, and what I learned a lot was watching master indigenous healers. I watched the way that they worked with people. I watched the kind of care and concern that they showed to people who were sometimes in desperate situations. I watched the way that they were able to hold space. And, people use that term all the time. And I don't think that they necessarily know what that term really means. And to me, we were talking about getting to essential coaching skills. If I had to tell you one skill that I think is the absolutely essential coaching skill, this is it. The ability to be with someone else in their suffering. To be with them in their suffering and not rush to fix it. To me, that is the absolute essential coaching skill.
Wow. And that is
because
also
what happens
is holding space?
Yeah, it's holding space and not rushing to fix someone.
Gotcha. Wow.
Because what happens, as I said, these were some of these old men that I got to be with, in my opinion. Well, I should say old men and women. They were absolute masters at this. And there was, so modeling master healers, in my opinion, is an essential coaching skill. And I was lucky because most people don't have that kind of experience. Most people in the non-Indian world don't have a chance to be able to sit back and watch the way that people do this in ceremony. So ceremony provides this safe container for the healing to take place. And there are some things that happen in ceremony that pave the way for the change that's going to take place. If a person only has in their mind that coaching is about exercising a particular technique, then they are quick to jump to what that is. They're quick to pull it out of the toolbox and quickly try to change someone. Whereas, in my opinion, we have to lay a foundation first, and that foundation is holding space and entering into the world of that person with their suffering. Because it's suffering on some level that is usually at the root of why somebody wants to be either healed or seek coaching in the first place. If everything is going along fine, there's no need to create change. But when we reach a threshold in our lives where we say, enough is enough, something's got to change here, that's the motivation to do something different. But a true healer has to be able to enter into the world of that other person. And that, to me, is very intimate. And to me, it's also a very spiritual encounter. So, for example, when I work with someone, usually one of the first things that I tell them is that this is a three-way partnership. It's a partnership between you, me, and the creator, or the architect of the universe, or whatever you consider that transcendent power to be. And you have a responsibility on what you're going to do. I have a responsibility in what I'm going to do. And I don't think we have the right to invite in the creator to be a part of this until we do the part that we have said we're going to do. Because it's very easy to just say, I want to wave a magic wand and have this transcendent God take care of my problems. But that's not what we're talking about here at all. What we're talking about is I have a responsibility. I have a responsibility as a healer, or I have a responsibility as the client to do my part and then invite in the power of the creator.
Wow. So let me just stop you there, and I hope that my asking questions won't take you away from your thread, because you clearly are on a very fascinating thread, bead here. But I do have some questions. If it's okay if I ask you, yeah,
please.
I think it's pretty clear to most of our listeners that this is a different approach to coaching than most of us have taken, and that, like as an NLP practitioner or hypnotherapist, people come into my office with a problem, and we do a technique or two to fix the problem. If it's a coaching relationship, then usually it's not just a one-off, one session, fix the problem sort of thing, but we have more of a longer-term process that we go through, if you will, but it still tends to be very outcome-oriented. There may be a bigger, different levels of outcome, like there might be a particular issue that needs to be fixed, and then there's a bigger outcome of, personal transformation as well, deepening of the understanding of the individual's place on the planet or something like that, but it's still, generally speaking, outcome-oriented. And although there are practices, certainly in hypnosis, as an example, that could be thought of as ceremony, sort of ceremonial practices that we do, rarely is that term ever used. There's no ceremony of healing that takes place. When you use the word ceremony, are you talking about a ceremony the way that we usually I think of a ceremony that we enter into a church or something, and we have a ceremony where there's some music, and then there's some prayer or whatever. What do you mean by ceremony specifically?
So fortunately, what Curanderismo did for me was that it created a new understanding for me of how ceremony can be applied and changed to the needs of a particular individual. And as a quick story of how I came to this metaphor that I'm going to use in explanation, I was in a restaurant in Manhattan with a friend of mine who had gone through one of the apprenticeships with me in Curanderismo, and we kind of locked horns and had a disagreement about the way that it's done. And I was trying to figure out how to explain to her what were new revelations to me at the time were. And I was looking down at the table, and all of a sudden it hit me that I had the explanation. And I said, earlier on in my learning, I thought Curanderismo was the plate, the knife, the fork, and the glass, and the salt and pepper shaker, that those constituted Curanderismo. Now what I think is that Curanderismo is the table underneath it. It's the table that supports those things rather than the objects themselves. And that became the germ of this idea for me of how to creatively introduce all kinds of other elements, including NLP and Ericksonian hypnosis. So in Curanderismo, the ceremony, there are two parts to most ceremonies, and they are the plática and the limpia. Plática is a heart-to-heart talk, and it is different than Western psychotherapy, although there are certain parallels. But for example, we usually hold hands with the client, and we look directly into their eyes and insist on the same thing from them. We purify the space. We purify the person with the smoke of copal. We then look at what the presenting problem is and delve deeper and deeper into it, like peeling layers of an onion. And interestingly enough, there's also a parallel in the work, for example, that you would recognize in sleight of mouth, because we try to identify what the limiting belief is that has led to the problem. Mm-hmm. And then we use the sacred four directions in addressing that. So there are things that we turn to the different directions for in this realignment and this changeover of traditional belief. Then there is the limpia part, which is the spiritual cleansing that takes the ideas that were identified in the plática and ceremonializes it. So, for example, we'll use a bundle of herbs for something called a barrida, or sweeping. And we use this bundle of herbs to sweep away the emotional dust that has settled on the person. And the belief behind this is that we experience toxic emotions, and normally we don't have a way to get rid of them. So what they do is they just pile up. So we physically are brushing the body from one end to the other using these herbs. So whereas that gets at the surface, the energy on the surface, the next step is to absorb something that's deeper, and we use an egg for that, which is the perfect single cell. And the egg absorbs all of this toxic energy that has been stored inside. And there's, a very specific way that it's done, rubbing the egg, chanting or praying all the while, and going through this whole procedure. Then there's a way to ceremonially dispose of the egg. In some cases, you read the egg, so you break the egg into a glass of water, and you can use it as a way to determine who or what the problems are. I had one. There are lots of ways of using that as a diagnostic tool. I saw a man in Mexico, in a rural part of Mexico, who actually used the egg to diagnose how the specific internal organs are operating, that there are different parts of the interior of the egg that correspond to the physical organs in that person's body. At any rate, the egg can either be just disposed of, or it can be cracked open and then used diagnostically. Then normally there's a closing. Now this is where I came to use some of what I learned in how to conduct prayer. Now I'm actually going to tie this back, interestingly enough, to Ericksonian hypnosis, because I was studying Ericksonian, at least the writings of Erickson, at the time that I was learning all of this, and I was trying to understand how this passive use of language in Ericksonian patterns can be used to affect change. And that's how I came to a way of using prayer that was hypnotic. Mm-hmm. And this goes back to also to the studies that I did in the history of something called the ghost dance movement. And in the 1800s, there was a Paiute prophet named Wovoka who had a vision that there was a way to make the buffalo come back from extinction, for making the white people leave and bringing back the spirits of the ancestors. And in it, he was told to have the people hold hands and do a particular type of round dance with a particular type of song that went along with it. But here's the interesting part. James Mooney was an anthropologist who was hired by the federal government to investigate certain things that were going on among Plains Indians. And when he went, what he noticed was something really, really curious. He noticed that the women were mostly the dancers, while the men were the singers. And Wovoka would take an eagle feather, and he would use this rhythmic motion in front of the women as a way of starting this dance, and that they would frequently fall down on the ground and go into trance spontaneously during this dance. Huh. And he described it in his writings as a type of hypnosis. Mm-hmm. So I was thinking, well, that's really interesting. Let me look more into hypnosis. And then in learning about Erickson, it came to me that he uses this very indirect way of establishing change. And so the way that I learned to pray was on behalf of the patient or the client, with an idea toward them, rather than prayer being asking God to take over and do something for them, for the prayer to bring out the resources that they already have in them so that they can understand their condition in a different way, so that they can see themselves as agencies of their own change as opposed to being a victim in the process.
Sounds very Ericksonian to me. Wow. This is fascinating. Do people ever come to you without knowing that this is all that you do? They just know that you're a good coach, and then you start saying, well, we're going to rub this egg on you now, and then...
Generally, well, more often than not, the way that people started to come to me was because of my Temazcal. So the Temazcal I mentioned is the Mesoamerican version of the sweat lodge. Right. And when
I have one in your backyard,
I have here in my yard, right? It's a pretty big one. I mean, we get over 30 people inside.
Oh, really?
So it's a pretty good size.
That's huge.
So by creating it as a community Temazcal, what I agreed to, I guess you could say, is that I am the caretaker of it. So it's not something that I own as much as something that I hold for the sake of a community. And this community has built up over the years of, some curious people, non-Mexican people, and a lot of, frankly, I would say 70% of the people who come are Mexican. And, either they knew about Temazcal when they lived in Mexico, or they want to somehow go back to their old roots, even though they're living here in New York. So really the people who came to me initially were people who kind of got to know me and what I do from being in the Temazcal, where I take that role of the ceremonial leader during our Temazcal session. Uh-huh. So that's kind of the way that people have come to me.
Wow, it's absolutely fascinating to me. Absolutely. My background is nothing as in depth as yours, but I was also fascinated by Native American cultures and studied a bit with a woman in upstate New York named Twyla Nitsch, who was she was the granddaughter of the last, I think, Mohawk.
Seneca, I believe.
Seneca?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think. I could be wrong.
But
I know the name. Yeah.
Yeah. But anyway, I had minimal studies with her, but I did go to the reservation there, which was not far from my university, and spent some Wednesday nights there where she let people like me in there and tell us and teach us and stuff like that. It was fascinating. Did some sweat lodge type things and some purification ceremonies. Did a lot of investigation on my own, probably not well, but did it anyway. So certainly explored, and I'm very familiar with the idea of the depth of the work that's going into there and the sacredness of it, and certainly I believe that it has informed my work a little bit as well, from certainly the Ericksonian standpoint. And my NLP work doesn't tend to be quite as cut and dry, like do a technique, although it can be from time to time. But I have great respect for it, certainly. And I'm just curious, when you think of coaching now, do you ever do anything that's not what you've just described? Do you ever do?
Oh yeah.
NLP?
Yeah, so what I just described to you is kind of where we start.
Uh-huh.
So somebody could come to me for just a limpia. They just feel like they need to get something off their chest, or they, something's just not right and they want to come in for a tune-up. So that could be done with no plática at all, or very minimal. We just have a conversation for 5 minutes and then start ceremonializing it. Mm-hmm. But the longer term work, what I would describe as deep dive work, uses that only as a touch off point. And so, since COVID hit, I've been doing this on Zoom with clients that see me either once a week or on alternating weeks, once every other week, for the entire duration of COVID.
So let me just stop you there. How do you do this on Zoom? Do they have to have their own egg and eagle feathers? Really?
Yeah. So when it comes to the ceremonial part of it, they mirror what I do.
Uh-huh. Wow.
And we do all the steps. It's just that
they have to get some copal. They have to get hold of the herbs and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I prefer it that way. I prefer if they use copal, but if not, they can use sage or palo santo.
Mm-hmm.
But they do. Whereas normally I would be using something called a poposhkomit, which is the ceremonial vessel for burning copal.
Right.
Normally I would use that on them. If they are a long-term person with me, they'll get one from me as a gift that they can then start to use. And a lot of some of the people who come to me are in the process of becoming healers themselves, which is why it really is using this wounded healer archetype. And a lot of times there are people who want to be healers and have studied technique, but don't necessarily know how to create something that is truly their own. And that's why when we go deep into an understanding of what needs to be healed, that it becomes like a formula for understanding how that person is going to work with somebody else. And a lot of the work also has to do with a concept called susto, which is a term anthropologists call magical fright. Now, it overlaps a lot with trauma therapy. And the problem that I have with the way that the term trauma is being used today in the popular literature is that it sometimes sort of trivializes what a trauma is. And to me, a trauma is a severe event, being in a situation where you see somebody murdered in front of you or a severe car accident.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas a susto is a moment of spiritual fright or soul fright. And what happens is, according to this belief system, what happens is that a part of you leaves, a splinter, and they call it a soul part. Now, we're modern folks, so we might not believe that you have a piece of your soul that leaves, but certainly a piece of you is left at the place at the time that the susto happened. And one susto, this is the part that I've discovered, is that one susto seems to lead to a lifetime of similar sustos, thematically connected in one way or another. And being that you're living in the country, you might understand the analogy that I'm going to give you. If you ever live in a country house where you get one mouse, all of a sudden you don't have one mouse, you have a bunch of mice. Yes. Because one mouse figures out the way to get into your house. Mm-hmm. And then they leave a scent trail that the other mice follow, so they get in. And to me, that's what susto is like. One susto creates an opening for the other sustos to take place. And that's why if you look at the chain of sustos that a person has in doing, and one piece of this is soul retrieval, we go to those moments, we go to those places where each susto took place in order to bring back that part that was left behind. Mm-hmm. And we do this ceremonially.
Wow.
It has obviously a corresponding psychological process that takes place. But what I found in my deep work with the people who are healers is all of a sudden they get these aha moments when they experience the connection between the different sustos and then find out, you know what? That had a lot to do with why I went into healing in the first place. And then all of a sudden they start attracting people to their business to their practice who somehow have something in alignment with that.
Right. Well, that sounds very, very familiar to me, actually. I can relate to having that in my own life. And one of the reasons perhaps I became a healer, not just a musician, because there was a transition period where I was a musician. That was what I did. That's what I earned my living doing. But then I had to, in a sense, transition in order to find my own healing. I did that, and then I became a healer, if you will.
Exactly.
Yeah. Fascinating. Susto, huh? So that is also interesting, with havening, the havening techniques that I've been doing. There's that we do a process called transpirational havening, where once we've seems to have helped alleviate the traumatic encoding of the original event, we do this transpirational sort of calling forth of the traumas, giving it a name, and then repeating that name over and over again. And it seems to be, taking out all the related other, traumas that are similar but different than all related together to get them all out. So seems like a very similar sort of processing.
Yeah, I would say.
Yeah. Fascinating.
So those are two. So I've only told you two pieces of what I do.
Good. We have to have you back. This is
so. At any rate, so. It all begins with those elements: the platica, the limpia, and the soul retrieval, and then it sets us up toward a course of self inquiry, peeling away at layer after layer after layer, to understand what it is that needs to be healed, and then how to align that with the work in healing other people, so that I actually coach people through a development of something that becomes their own unique healing style, in the same way that I came to mine out of these various pieces, and through the fulfillment in vision and dreams of how to create this modality that I do.
Wow. I know we're getting close to the end of our allotted time for today, so I don't want to take you too much down another pathway. But I do want to have you back because I want to learn more about this. Just so people know, you have your own podcast as well.
I do.
So if people want to hear more from you, and you're also within that podcast, you're interviewing other healers. A lot of times that's what I've been listening to.
In lots of non-Western modalities, yeah. So the podcast is called Healing and Spirituality in World Cultures. And it's on iTunes. It's on all the major platforms.
So that's the name of it, Healing, say it again?
Healing and Spirituality in World Cultures.
World Cultures.
With Robert Vetter.
With Robert Vetter. So Robert, not Bob.
Well, that's what it is on there, but everybody knows me as Bob.
Good. That's quite a mouthful for a title of a podcast.
I know, it's too many words.
They're good words. And is there a website that people can find you at as well?
Well, I'm in the process, and it's funny you said Bob Vetter, because my website that I'm in the process of putting together will be bobvetter.com.
Okay, so it doesn't exist yet, bobvetter.com?
It doesn't exist yet. I have the
you have the URL
domain, but the website is not up yet. Hopefully within about a month it'll be up. So
maybe by the time people listen to this, bobvetter.com will be a reality.
But I can give out my email address if that's okay.
What's that?
So that is bobv1111 at AOL.com.
1111, 4 ones.
4 ones.
bobv, BOBV 1111 at AOL.com?
I'm the last person on AOL.
How old are you?
Too old. I got that domain. I got that when dinosaurs roamed the earth.
Oh dear, that's very funny. So, quick question: what about stuff like ayahuasca and stuff? I know there's a lot of people that have done these things. It's the type of thing I would have done in college. I didn't ever do ayahuasca, but what is your opinion about people doing things like that?
Well, I am not necessarily in favor of it. With certain, let me just say, being here in New York, I am not in favor of it in the way that it has become. So it started out as something that took place in an indigenous context within indigenous cultures in South America. And in order to be involved in it, somebody would have to go there and put all that effort into it. It has become something now here in New York where they say you could find an ayahuasca ceremony every weekend of the year somewhere in Brooklyn or Manhattan. That people are hosting these events in their living rooms. And to me, it's taking something that's sacred within a particular culture out of context, and people are using it because they believe that it's a spiritual shortcut to enlightenment.
Right.
So I don't necessarily see that as a positive thing.
Cool.
I think that it's important that we all understand that we're in this for the long haul, that self-knowledge and healing is not something that takes place overnight, and that for the most part, it's something that requires our dedication, our understanding, our prayer, our sincerity. And I just don't see all of those things in the popular ayahuasca movement.
Yeah, I can appreciate that. I probably even agree for the most part. I think that while many people are looking for a shortcut, it is also true, I think, for a lot of people that when they're doing that, they realize, that it is a commitment. After you've swallowed that brew, I mean, I've never done it, but I can just imagine having done other things similar in the way distant past. That once you've ingested the medicine, you're in it. You're committed to it. There's learning's going to happen from the plant medicines.
You've paid for the roller coaster ride. Now you got to see it through.
Yeah, there's no getting off once you got on. Yeah, and there's everyone that I know that has done it. Everyone that I know personally that has done it has given me very positive reports of their experiences from having done it, and are glad that they did. So, and I'm not, people should do whatever they want. I'm just telling you why I am not personally involved in it in any way. Good. But it does also seem to me that once a person has done that, then they can say, okay, this has been a really good introduction to this, kind of world of ways of thinking, and that if I wanted to go deeper into it, then I could, go to bobvetter.com.
I would like to say that I encourage anybody who would like to go down the road of a deep spiritual dive, that we co-create something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And whereas my own mentors were people that I got to be with, and watch the way that they worked, they didn't work with me to step by step in the way that I work with someone to help them to find their particular way.
When someone does enter into working with you, usually how long are we talking as far as
Well, I mean, we kind of decide at the beginning what our plan is. So somebody may come for one session. Somebody may say, well, I want to work on this one particular issue, and we'll dedicate like a number of sessions, let's say 4 or 6 sessions, to try to attain that goal. But the people who are really, really serious about aligning this with developing their own healing modality, we're talking, I would say, 9 months to a year of steady work.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Very cool.
But then they own it. It's truly theirs, as opposed to something that they got from somebody else.
Yeah. I get that. Well, I'm absolutely fascinated, and I would like this to be part one of a ongoing, at least 2 parts, because there's more that I want to learn from you. But thank you for this. This was a in-depth discussion about what can obviously be some really in-depth work with people, and yeah.
Well, Doug, if you don't mind, let me give a shout out
Sure.
about how much I appreciate the work that you do and the sincerity and the dedication that you have to walking your talk. So just want to throw that out for the listeners, the profound respect that I have for you.
Well, thank you. Right back at you. Thank you so much for being here, and I hope that we do this again real soon.
Be my pleasure. Thank you for having me, Doug.
This has been the Essential Coaching Skills Podcast. Thank you for being here. It's a pleasure seeing you again. Hope to see you again real soon. Come back next week when we have another gripping and exciting episode of the Essential Coaching Skills Podcast. And if you want to, you can find out more about us, each and every one of us, at essentialcoachingskills.com. Thanks.